Camping alone in Yellowstone has always been one of my biggest dreams. I wanted to disconnect from the world, escape the noise of the city, and spend a few nights under the stars. But what I found in those woods, it changed my life forever. Because that night, I realized I wasn't alone. I chose a secluded spot, far from the main trails. The silence was absolute, just the wind blowing through the trees, the rustling of dry leaves, and in the distance, the distant howl of a wolf. I set up my tent, lit a small fire, and prepared something to eat. Night fell quickly, and the sky was covered in stars. For a moment, I felt at peace, but then the noises started. At first, it was just crackling in the brush. Nothing unusual, probably a deer or some small animal passing by. But as time went on, the sounds got closer and slower, as if someone were walking around my tent. I stopped chewing. I held my breath. Silence filled the camp. Then I heard a footstep, and then another, heavy, calculated. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it around me. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the faint reflection of the burning campfire. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it's just my imagination, I thought. But then I saw it. At the edge of the darkness, two fresh footprints in the dirt, just behind my tent. And they weren't animal footprints. They were human footprints. My heart raced. If it had been a bear, I would have known what to do. If it had been a coyote, I could scare it away. But a man, who could be there in the middle of the forest at that time of night? If it was another backpacker, he would have made noise, said something, I thought. But this someone didn't want to be seen, and that was what scared me the most. I tried to ignore it. I went back inside the tent and zipped it up. The fire outside lit up the canvas, creating strange shadows. The night got even colder. I tried to sleep, but then I heard breathing, right outside the tent. Low, slow, heavy. Someone was there, and they knew I was awake. My mind screamed at me not to move, but every cell in my body wanted to run away. The silence was total, and then the tent zipper started to move, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The chill down my spine paralyzed me. I gripped my flashlight tightly. If this opens, I'll run. But suddenly it stopped, and then I heard the footsteps moving away, slow, heavy, disappearing into the forest. I waited for long minutes. Then I gathered my courage and left the tent. The fire was almost out. The cold wind cut my face. I shined my light on the ground, and I saw deep footprints in the earth, circling my tent. But the worst of it all, there were handprints in the corners of the fabric, as if someone had crouched there and watched me while I slept. My whole body froze. My instincts screamed to get out of there, but I couldn't run in the dark. If I ran, I might get lost. So I did what any terrified person would do. I stayed awake until the sun came up, staring into the darkness, waiting, listening, but nothing else happened. At least, not that night. Because the next day, I discovered something even worse. The sun rose slowly. I spent the whole night awake, holding my flashlight and listening to every little sound around me. When the first light broke through the treetops, I could finally breathe. But the feeling of relief was short-lived, because when I stepped out of the tent, I realized something was wrong. The footprints around the tent were still there, but now there were more, many more, and they weren't just footprints. They were marks of someone dragging their feet on the ground, as if they had been walking around the camp all night, as if they were waiting for something, as if they were having fun with me. My heart raced. I pulled on my backpack and started packing everything. I didn't want to stay there another second, but when I turned to take down the tent, I stopped. The zipper was completely open. I was sure I had closed it the night before, but now it was wide open, as if someone had been inside. And then I saw what was in my backpack, and I knew, in that instant, that someone had gone through my things. At the bottom of my backpack, inside one of the side pockets, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. My hands shook as I pulled out the note. I opened it slowly and read the only words written there. "I could have taken you." My entire body froze. My eyes went straight to the footprints around the tent. Someone had been here all night, got through my things, watched me sleep, and I hadn't even noticed. If he had wanted to, I could have disappeared into that forest without a trace. I threw everything into my backpack and started walking as fast as I could. The trail seemed much longer now. The air was heavier. The sounds of the forest were louder. I felt like I was being watched, that someone was hiding in the trees, waiting, watching. I walked without stopping for almost an hour, and then I saw the road. Safety. My car parked. I ran. I jumped in and locked the doors. My chest rose and fell as I tried to breathe. But before I started the car, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. In the middle of the trees, he was there, standing, tall, with a long coat and his face hidden in the shadows. The same man who had watched me all night, the same man who could have taken me. He didn't run. He didn't try to hide. He just stood there, staring at me, as if he was waiting for the next time, because now he knew who I was. And somehow, I knew this wasn't over yet. I never camped alone again, but sometimes I get the feeling that I'm still being watched. At night, if I'm walking alone, or if I park my car in a secluded spot, I get a chill on the back of my neck, and I wonder, if I look in the rearview mirror, will he be there again, waiting, smiling, ready to finish what he started? I had been alone on the trail for 3 days. The Appalachian Trail has always been one of my favorite challenges. Hiking for hours, through dense forests and silent mountains, made me feel alive. But that night, I saw something that should never have been there. And that was when I realized that some things in the woods don't want to be found. The sun was setting when I realized I had made a mistake. I had been late. The trail I was supposed to follow disappeared into the darkness. My legs were tired, and the cold was beginning to creep through the forest. My flashlight flickered, its battery already low. If I didn't find a place to camp soon, I would have to spend the night in the middle of nowhere. But then, I saw it. At the top of the hill, between the trees, a dim light flickered. A cabin. There. Seeing a building in the middle of that trail was unusual. Most of the cabins in the area had been abandoned for years, but this one had a light, and at that moment, it seemed like a lucky sign. So, without thinking twice, I headed towards the light. The climb was difficult. The trees seemed denser, as if they were watching me. The air became heavier, colder, but finally, I arrived, and the cabin was there. It was small, made of dark wood, and had a sloping roof. The light came from inside, flickering like a candle or a lantern. And the strangest thing, the door was open. Does someone live here? I thought. Maybe another backpacker or a forest ranger. I approached slowly. The ground creaked under my feet. I knocked on the door. Nothing. The silence was absolute. The wind no longer blew. The trees seemed frozen in time. So I took a deep breath and went inside. The cabin was small, a table in the center, a simple bed in the corner, and a lantern flickering gently. But what bothered me the most was the smell. That smell of wet earth, as if someone had brought the forest inside. I approached the table, and that's when I saw it. A plate of food, still warm. Someone was here, but where? Is anyone there? My voice sounded strangely loud. No answer. I looked at the lantern. The flame flickered. The food was steaming. Someone had just left. The silence was unbearable. My heart was pounding. Then, a sound broke the air. A footstep, behind me. I turned around on reflex. Nothing. The door was still open, swinging slightly. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the corners of the cabin. The floor was covered in footprints, but there was just one terrifying detail. The footprints didn't go into the cabin. They only went out. There were many of them, as if several people had left at the same time. But I was sure no one had come in. A shiver ran down my spine. I had to get out of there. I turned to the door, ready to run back to the trail. But then, something made me stop. There, right on the doorframe, scratched into the wood, my name, written over and over, as if someone had marked my arrival. My body froze. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my backpack and ran down the trail. The cold wind bit my face. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop, because when I looked back, the light in the cabin had gone out, and in the darkness, I saw silhouettes standing at the entrance, watching, waiting, knowing that I would return. My feet slid on the dirt trail. The wind howled through the trees. Every shadow around me seemed to move, but nothing was worse than that cabin on top of the hill. The light went out, and then I saw it. Shapes standing in the doorway, staring at me. My whole body wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I stood there, frozen, watching those motionless figures in the darkness. My eyes adjusted to the pitch black, and then I noticed something even worse. They had no faces. The air grew heavy. A feeling of pressure in my chest made me want to scream, but I knew I couldn't. Not here, not while they were still watching me. And then, in the complete silence, they began to move. It wasn't a normal movement. They weren't walking. They glided, like shadows cast by the extinguished lamp, and they were coming towards me. Panic took over my body. I turned and ran. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it would explode. The branches scratched my face, but I didn't look back. I couldn't, because if I did, I knew they would be closer. The forest seemed like an endless maze. Every tree was the same as the last. Every curve made me doubt if I was on the right path. And then I heard it, the sound, low, faint, but clear enough to make me shiver. Whispers. They weren't behind me anymore. Now, they were everywhere. The wind carried distorted voices, words I didn't understand, but somehow I knew they were talking about me. My legs were burning. Sweat was pouring down my face, even in the bitter cold. I needed to find the main trail. I needed to get somewhere safe. Then I saw a clearing. The moon lit up the open space. I stopped in the middle of it, panting. I turned around, expecting to see those figures at the edge of the forest, but they were gone. The silence returned. Nothing but the wind and the rustling of leaves. No whispers, no shadows. The forest was empty, as if nothing had happened. But I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. And then I saw something on the ground, and I felt my stomach turn. There were footprints in the dirt, lots of them. They were scattered all over the clearing, but they weren't mine. They were theirs, and they were coming from all directions, as if I had run straight to where they wanted me. The feeling of terror was unbearable. Adrenaline made me get out of there as fast as I could. When I finally found the road, I threw myself to the ground, exhausted. My body was shaking, my lungs were burning, but for the first time that night, I felt safe, or at least I thought I was, until I realized something was in my pocket. My trembling hands pulled out the crumpled paper. My mind refused to believe it. I hadn't put anything there, but now there was a small folded piece of paper, and when I opened it, my heart stopped, because there, written in shaky letters, was a single sentence. "We saw you, and we will be back." I never went back to the Appalachian Trail. I never camped alone again. But to this day, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of the wind whispering against my window, and I wonder, do they still watch me, waiting, preparing for the next time? If there's one thing I've learned traveling alone on the roads of the United States, it's that Route 66 hides secrets that no one wants to talk about. I've always been skeptical of ghost stories, but that night, in the middle of the Arizona desert, I saw something I'll never forget. Because on that road, I picked up a passenger who shouldn't have existed. I'd been driving for hours. The road seemed endless, surrounded by distant mountains and a dark, moonless sky. The last town had long since been left behind, and the next gas station was still far away. My only company was the roar of the engine and the crackling radio. The fuel gauge was low, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop, because ever since it got dark, I felt like I wasn't alone. It was just a feeling, something in the air, the kind of thing that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up for no reason. Then I saw someone on the side of the road, a man standing still, wearing a dark coat. He raised his hand. He was asking for a ride. I instinctively slammed on the brake. The car slowed down, but at the same moment, something made me hesitate. What was he doing there, in the middle of the desert, far from everything? And how did he seem so still? As if he wasn't waiting for a car, but for my car. My mind screamed at me to keep going, but before I could step on the gas, he was already at the passenger window. I don't remember seeing him move, just he was there, his face hidden in the shadow of the hood. His skin was pale, almost colorless. He opened the door before I could say anything, and he got in. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, almost emotionless. The sound of the door slamming echoed in the silence of the road. My palms were sweating on the steering wheel. I didn't know what to say. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. After a few seconds, he mumbled, "I just need to keep moving." The radio crackled, a staticky sound cutting through the air. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. His eyes were sunken and empty. He didn't blink. And the smell inside the car, it was strange, a mix of dust and something older, almost like wet earth. I kept driving. The silence inside the car became unbearable. Every mile I drove seemed to leave the normal world behind. The road seemed darker, longer. My chest began to tighten, as if something was wrong. Then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, the road behind us. It was gone. There were no more distant lights, no tire tracks on the asphalt, nothing. It was as if the world had disappeared behind the car. My heart raced. I turned to the passenger, trying to say something, but he was already looking at me, and he said only one thing: "You shouldn't have stopped." The silence inside the car was absolute. The road behind me had disappeared, and the man in the passenger seat, he was smiling. My mind screamed at me to stop the car and run away, but my body wouldn't listen. I was trapped. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the asphalt ahead. The road seemed darker now, longer, as if it would never end, and he just watched me. "You shouldn't have stopped," he repeated. This time his voice sounded different, deeper, more wrong. I tried to take a deep breath, to stay calm. "Who are you?" "Zrania." He didn't answer. He just turned his head slowly and pointed at the radio. The hissing grew louder, the sound waves distorted, and then a voice came, weak, scratchy, almost impossible to understand. But I could, because it was saying my name. My blood ran cold. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "Is this a prank?" I tried to laugh, but my voice cracked. "Is this a dream?" The passenger didn't blink. His skin seemed pale, almost translucent. "Keep driving," he murmured. But something in his tone, it sounded like an order. The landscape around me began to change. The signs on the road were worn away. The paint on the asphalt was fading. And then it hit me. This wasn't the same place I'd been before. I'd left Route 66. Now I was nowhere. The passenger looked at me. His eyes had no reflection. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said again. And this time, I understood. The car started to shake. The radio hissed louder. The speedometer dropped to 0, but I was still driving, as if time no longer existed, as if I was trapped in something bigger than myself. And then, I felt the cold touch on my shoulder. He held me. I screamed. The world around me fell apart. The headlights flickered. The radio exploded in static. And then, everything went black. I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the road. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, but something was wrong. My mind screamed. My whole body shook. because I didn't remember stopping. The road was deserted. I looked at the passenger seat, empty, but on the dashboard, there was a piece of aged paper. My fingers trembled as I picked it up, and when I opened it, I felt the world spin. There was only one sentence written there, in shaky, faded handwriting. "I've been in this car before." I started the car as fast as I could. The engine sputtered, hesitated, and then it started. I stepped on the gas, trying to ignore the shiver running down my spine. But as I drove, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. On the side of the road, someone was standing, in a dark coat, pale skin, head slightly tilted, looking directly at me, waiting, as if he knew I would come back, because somehow I knew this wasn't over yet. I had heard stories about Route 50, the most deserted road in the United States, the empty heart of the Mojave Desert, but nothing I had been told prepared me for that night, for that motel, for what awaited me inside. My car was almost out of gas. I had been driving for hours, surrounded by miles of sand and darkness. The last town had been behind me more than an hour earlier. The GPS wasn't working. The radio was just crackling, and the silence of the desert. It was absolute. And then I saw it, a rusty old sign blinking faintly on the side of the road. Desert Star Motel, rooms available. I slammed on the brakes. A motel? There? I hadn't seen any sign of civilization for miles, but the building was there, with lights on, and an open reception desk. The parking lot was empty, except for a single old car, covered in dust. I got out of my car and felt the air heavy. The wind blew slowly, dragging sand across the ground. And the silence, it seemed deeper than before. But I had no choice, so I went to the reception desk and rang the bell. The counter was covered in yellowed papers. A dim light bulb flickered overhead, and behind the counter, there was an old bell and a ledger. I waited, but no one came. So I rang the bell again, and that's when I heard footsteps, slow, shuffling. Someone was approaching. A door opened behind the counter, and a man came out, tall, thin, with sunken eyes and pale skin. He smiled, but the smile, it felt wrong. "Welcome to the Desert Star Motel," he said, his voice faint, like a distant echo. "Do you need a room for the night?" I hesitated. Every instinct inside me screamed to get out of here, but I was tired. There was nowhere else to sleep. "Yes," I said. He took a key from the panel behind him. "Room 12. And then, before he handed me the key, he looked me in the eye and said something that made me freeze. "Don't open the door to the room next door." He smiled again and slid the key across the counter. "Have a good night." I swallowed hard. I took the key without saying anything and left the reception area. But as I walked down the dark hallway to my room, I felt someone was watching me. The room was simple, a double bed, an old table, an old TV. Nothing special, but the smell. It was dusty, of something that had been closed for a long time, as if no one had slept there for years. But worst of all was the next door, room 11. It was different from the others. The wood seemed darker, the lock rusty, and the doorknob, as if someone had tried to rip it off. I turned my face away. I did my best to ignore it. I closed my door. I locked myself in and tried to sleep. But then, in the middle of the night, I heard a sound, low, faint, coming from next door. Someone was knocking. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from next door, low, faint, slow and irregular, as if someone didn't want to wake up the entire motel. Just, "Mister." My chest tightened. I knew what the receptionist had said. Don't open the door to the next room. But now, someone was there, someone who wanted me to open it. I swallowed hard. I lay still in bed. The silence of the desert seemed heavier. The clock on the nightstand read 3:33 in the morning. Time seemed to stand still. And then, the knock came again. This time, louder. Knock, knock, knock. My breathing became heavy. What did I do? Pretend I couldn't hear it? Run away? Or, looking through the peephole, number I shouldn't have. But before I could convince myself, I stood up and walked to the door. I put my hand on the doorknob. My legs were shaking. With each step, the air grew colder. The dim light in the room flickered as if it were going to go out. So, I took a deep breath and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the sound was still there. The knocking. Knock, knock, knock. Closer, louder. I took a step back. My back hit the wall. Sweat dripped down my forehead. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror, the doorknob to room 11 turned by itself. The air left my lungs. The sound of metal grinding echoed through the room. The wood creaked, as if someone was pushing the door from the other side. But the lock held, the latch held, and then silence returned. I stood still, waiting for something to happen. My heart was pounding. Then I took a deep breath. I took a step forward and touched the doorknob of room 11. My hand was shaking. The cold was intense. Then, with a dry snap, the door opened. Alone. The room was dark. The dim light from the hallway lamp barely illuminated the interior. The air smelled of mold, dust, and something else rotten. A smell of wet earth, of something buried long ago, of something that should never have been unearthed. My heart was telling me to run. My mind was screaming not to go in. But something was pulling me in. And then I saw it, in the middle of the room, on the rotting wooden floor. Footprints, wet, fresh, and they weren't mine. My eyes followed the footprints to the bed. The sheets were rumpled, as if someone had just gotten up from there, but the room was empty, or at least, it seemed to be. Suddenly, the sound of the phone broke the silence. Tink, tink, tink. The old phone in my room rang. I ran back and answered it with shaking hands. The line was full of crackles, but among the noises, a voice whispered, low, scratchy, distant, "You are in my place." I threw the phone on the floor. I grabbed my things and ran out of the room. The hallway seemed darker. The doors closed. The silence was overwhelming. I needed to get out of there. I reached the reception, frantically ringing the bell, but the receptionist was not there. There was no one. The guest book was open. My eyes went straight to the last page, and my blood ran cold, because there, on the guest list, my name was already written, but with an old date, a date from 20 years ago, and right below, the name of another guest, the last person who stayed in room 11, the last person who disappeared on that road. I ran out into the parking lot. My car was still there. I jumped in and slammed the door. The key turned in the ignition. The engine sputtered. For a second, I thought it wouldn't start. But then, the car roared to life, and I sped away. The road seemed darker. The moon disappeared behind the clouds. The motel sign faded away. But in the rearview mirror, I saw it. The front desk was still lit up, and at the door, someone was watching me leave. I never went back down that road. I never looked back. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, when my phone rings, no number identified, I answer without thinking, and on the other end of the line, I hear a whisper, low, scratchy, "You are in my place." I've always been a lover of hiking, dense forests, clean air, the silence of nature. But on that trip to the Great Smoky Mountains, I learned something. Not all silence is safe. Not all trails are meant to be hiked. And that night, someone followed me in the darkness. The plan was simple, a 2-day hike through the forest, camping along the way. Nothing but trees, mountains, and the solitude of the green desert. But when I got to the park information booth, the ranger looked at me strangely. "Are you going alone?" "Yes," I said. He was silent for a moment. Then he took out a map and circled an area with a pencil. "Don't follow that trail here." Looking closer, I saw a narrow path cutting through the forest. A name scrawled beside it, "Whispering Trail." "Why?" I asked. The ranger sighed. There's something there that makes people uneasy. What do you mean? He hesitated. Some say they hear things, others say they don't hear anything. He forced a smile. Stay on the main trail and you'll be safe. I laughed, but now I wanted to know what was out there. I'd been walking all day. The forest was thick and ancient. The sun barely made it through the tall leaves. The silence was absolute, so absolute that it began to bother me. No sound of birds, no twigs snapping, nothing, like the forest was holding its breath. Then, in the middle of the afternoon, I saw the trail, the one I wasn't supposed to follow, the whispering trail. The path was narrow, covered in dead leaves. The trees hunched over it, as if trying to hide its existence. I stopped at the entrance. The air there was different, heavier, like it was waiting for me. I should have stayed on the main trail, but I did. One step forward, and another, until the forest closed behind me. The silence inside was absolute. No wind, no animals, nothing. I walked slowly, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Then I heard a whisper, low, slow, almost imperceptible. I froze. I turned my head slowly. There was no one, but the whispers didn't stop. I wanted to believe it was the wind, but the wind doesn't say my name. The wind doesn't laugh softly. I took a few more steps. The whispers got louder, and then I saw something on the ground. Footprints, but they weren't from boots. They were barefoot and small, like children, heading into the forest. My instincts screamed to turn back, but I kept going. I don't know why. Maybe because part of me needed to know. That's when I saw it. The cabin. It was in the middle of the trail. Small, dark wood and a sloping roof, covered with leaves, as if it had been there for centuries. But the footprints stopped right at the entrance, and inside, someone was waiting for me. I knew because I heard breathing. Low, slow, heavy. The door was ajar. The darkness inside felt solid. I held my flashlight. My heart hammered in my chest. I took a step forward. The wood of the floor creaked, and then the door opened by itself. I saw inside. The air was still. A table, a chair, a dead fireplace, and in the corner of the cabin, someone stood with their back to me, tall, still, breathing slowly, as if they knew I was there. Every cell in my body screamed to run, but I stood there, frozen. That's when the man turned his head, slowly, slowly, too slowly, as if his neck had no bones, and then he smiled. The man smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was wrong, too wide, too stretched, as if his face wasn't made for smiling. And then he started toward me. My body froze. My feet were rooted to the spot. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, but I couldn't move. The man took a step. The wood creaked, and the whispers came again, quiet, far away, but clear enough for me to understand. Don't look at him. I blinked, and the man was closer. He wasn't walking. He wasn't running. He was just getting closer. And now, his eyes were completely black. My chest tightened. I needed to get out of there. My hand shook as I reached for my flashlight. But then, the man stopped, his head tilted, watching me, and then he whispered, low, a wind almost passing through my ears. You heard them too, didn't you? I stumbled backward. I turned and ran. I left the cabin without looking back. The wind cut my face. The brush scratched my legs. But the whispers, they came with me. The trees seemed taller now, the trail narrower, and I couldn't find the way out. I should have gone back the same way, but now, everything seemed different. And then, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, heavy, following my every move. I didn't want to look, but I did, and there, among the trees, the man still stood, in the dark, smiling. But now, he wasn't alone. There were others, tall, still figures, shadows among the trees. There were many of them, and they were all looking at me. The whisper grew louder, more urgent. Don't look, Just run. And so I did. I ran until my legs burned. Sweat poured down my face. The air was heavy, cold. But then, I saw it. A clearing. And beyond it, the main trail. I was almost there. But then, I heard the last thing I expected. A laugh. Low, close, behind me. I turned in a reflex, and the man was inches from my face. The smile was now splitting through the stretched skin. The black eyes like endless holes. The wrong breathing. Cold. And then, he spoke one last time. See you on the next trail. And everything went dark. I woke up the next morning, in the middle of the main trail. The sun was beating down on my face. The silence was gone. The birds were singing. The wind was blowing through the leaves. But I was still shivering. I looked around. Nothing. No sign of footprints. No sign of the cabin. Or the man. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe the trail had played a trick on me. But then, I saw something in my pocket. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. It was a worn piece of paper with a single sentence scrawled on it. Shouldn't have gone off the trail. I never returned to the Great Smoky Mountains. But sometimes, when I'm hiking alone in some secluded place, I feel like someone is watching me, and in the silence of the forest, I think I can still hear the whispers, low, slurred, calling my name.